Hi, it's time for an AstroUnveiling, where we use astrology to try to unravel some unsolved mystery or crime. Over 10 years ago, Malaysia Airlines passenger flight MH370 was scheduled to take off from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing on March 8, 2014. About 40 minutes after takeoff, the Boeing 777 deviated sharply from its planned route and disappeared from civilian radar. Military radar later showed it turning back across Malaysia and then heading south over the Indian Ocean. Despite one of the largest multinational search efforts in aviation history, according to official sources, the main wreckage has yet to be found. The most widely accepted explanation is that the aircraft ended its flight in the southern Indian Ocean after running out of fuel, but the cause remains unknown. And the disappearance is considered one of aviation's greatest mysteries. There are several official theories that were considered, but all of them fail to explain certain key aspects of the flight's disappearance. First, investigators considered the possibility of mechanical failure or fire on board, but none of these scenarios match the aircraft's known long controlled flight after communications were lost. A catastrophic failure would not have allowed the plane to continue flying on autopilot for so many hours. Second, a decompression could have incapacitated the crew and passengers, leaving the aircraft to fly on autopilot until fuel exhaustion. But this scenario fails to explain the deliberate course changes, including the controlled turn back across Malaysia. Third, a deliberate intentional diversion by one of the cockpit crew as a murder-suicide was also considered, but no evidence was found to support pilot involvement. However, deliberate actions by the pilot or co-pilot could not be ruled out because the flight path changes appeared programmed or manually flown. Fourth, an unlawful interference by a third party such as a hijacking, hostage situation, or a remote takeover was considered, but no distress calls, no claims of responsibility, and no evidence from passenger background support this theory. A physical takeover of the cockpit was also considered unlikely due to the reinforced cockpit doors. Fifth, dangerous cargo such as lithium batteries that were known to be on board were considered as potential causes of a crash. But tests and scenario modeling showed this would not produce the flight's long controlled trajectory. Lastly, the theory that the plane suffered fuel exhaustion leading to an ocean impact was used to define the search area and does explain the final satellite data that tracked MH370's whereabouts, but it doesn't explain why the flight was initially diverted in the first place. Okay, so those are the theories considered. Let's see what the chart has to say. For this analysis, we're going to be using the chart for the departure time of the flight, which is pretty well documented. So the flight departed Kuala Lumpur International Airport at 12:41 a.m. Malaysia time on March 8, 2014. Of the theories posited about what happened to the plane, only two possible scenarios fit this chart. We'll discuss each one separately, although I believe they are related. The first thing we do is to establish the framing of the chart by examining its ascendant, which is in the sign of Sagittarius. The ascendant of any chart depicts the entity's life and path. Since the entity being born at this time is flight MH370, the ascendant represents the physical environment and circumstances into which this flight came into existence, its trajectory and guiding purpose of the flight that night, all of which is given by the ascendant. As we teach, signs represent needs. They indicate what's lacking. What's missing is what drives people to act by exercising the domicile rulers of that sign. Sagittarius is a sign that indicates a need for direction and orientation, which is quite interesting for a trip since we assume that if there's anything that a commercial flight has, it's a clear sense of its direction. But Sag here indicates that this flight's need for orientation and direction will become the most salient need driving the flight. Certainly, establishing MH370's whereabouts and the path it took is what we've all been discussing for about 10 years now. But this need is not ours. It was a driving need for the flight itself. We'll return to this point again in a bit. Now, let's talk about its significator. So, significator of Sag is Jupiter. Jupiter is Sagittarius's domicile ruler, and therefore, it's the planet that will provide the needed direction of the flight. In traditional astrology, we conceive of the domicile rulers as the owners or proprietors of the signs, of their signs. Since Sagittarius is the sign of the ascendant, Jupiter would be conceived as the ruler or owner of the flight. In our classes, I prefer to call the domicile rulers the providers of their houses and signs rather than the owners, simply because we can often provide that which we don't actually possess or own. This difference becomes relevant in this chart when we use our subject rule to assign planets to people. As the providers of the flight, Jupiter would then represent or be embodied by Captain Zahiri Shah, the pilot of MH370, who is the immediate provider of the flight. He doesn't actually own the plane or the airline, but he does make the trip possible by flying the plane. The owner or the provider of the flight would be the actual owner of Malaysia Airlines, or MAS for short. In this case, in 2014, that was the Malaysian government, through a company called Khazanah National Berhad, Khazanah for short, which owned 69% of MAS's shares and was thus the majority owner of the airline. So this is going to be relevant later on, but we'll table that discussion for now, since we're now considering Jupiter as the immediate provider of the flight, which is the pilot. In traditional astrology, there are signs where the triplicity ruler and the domicile rulers differ. Unfortunately, Sagittarius is not one of those signs. For Sag, the triplicity ruler is the same as its domicile ruler. In other words, Jupiter rules both domicile and triplicity. Had it been one of the other signs with different rulers, we could have assigned the triplicity ruler to Captain Shah and the domicile ruler to Khazanah, or KNF as it's called. This is because the triplicity ruler's function is to manage what it doesn't necessarily own, which would have made my work a lot easier here, but never mind, I just have to work harder to unravel this one. And you'll have to bear with me as I try to untangle it for you. Okay, so if we examine Jupiter here, we find that it's located in the 8th place, or the 8th house, in Cancer. This is a nocturnal chart, because the sun is below the horizon here, and there are no planets, no luminaries above the horizon. The moon has just set, actually, on the descendant. This was at takeoff, so the moon was just setting and the sun was below, so there are no luminaries above. Light is a good thing to travel in travel charts, so it's always better to have at least one luminary above the horizon if we can help it when we're scheduling flights, for example. Cancer in the 8th tells us that the pilot is concerned and motivated by a need for personal safety. Cancer, the need for protection or personal safety, while Jupiter's condition, being out of sect here in a nocturnal chart, tells us that his condition is inappropriate to the situation at hand. The 8th is a place of death and debt, among other things, but both of these are usually relevant, with death being the most obvious one for Captain Shah, for example, since we now know that it's fairly certain that he probably perished along with the other crew and passengers. The 8th was known in antiquity in Mesopotamia as the idle place because agricultural activity was known to stop in this month. Idleness is therefore the most characteristic trait found in this house. Planets in the 8th are often rendered inactive. So that's where you get the death thing coming from. So Jupiter's ability to navigate and seek its onward direction was made inactive. Jupiter can also elevate the need for safety and protection because it's exaltation lord of Cancer. So in a nocturnal chart, Jupiter is known to overstep its bounds and have a hard time navigating the situation it finds itself in. Let's now look at the Moon, which is the planet that fulfills the need for protection. Here, as ruler of the 8th, it's generating or providing death or debt. It doesn't necessarily do this on purpose. It can end up providing either of those things, death or debt, out of necessity or circumstance. Investigations into Captain Zahiri's life showed no evidence that he had any financial problems. But remember the debt part of this 8th house story, because it's going to come up later. Now, because the Moon sits on the descendant angle opposing the helm, that is the ascendant of this vehicle, which is the flight, it's actually receiving an open enemy, which is a clue that someone or something outside of the flight is opposing it. And I say open enemy because the 7th house is the house of open enemies, and the Moon represents the action of receiving. So there's a receiving here of something that's antagonistic to it. Actually, Gemini points to doubly opposing forces surrounding this Moon, which is moving slower than normal. This, together with the idleness of Jupiter up in the 8th house, signals a lack of movement and direction being imposed upon the flight, almost as if something's keeping the flight from going where it needs to go. And this is why it lacks safety. The Moon is the nocturnal ruler, so it's the ruler of the night chart. So it's not out of sect, which means it's not inappropriate. So this idea of protecting is appropriate to the situation, and the situation being the need for protection shown by Jupiter. But it is corrupted by Neptune on the angle, so this Moon is corrupted by the square from this Neptune, which is at 5 degrees here Pisces, and the Moon here at 7 of Gemini. And it's alongside, Neptune is alongside Chiron and the Sun. That means that the Moon was appropriately doing its protective duty, but was being impeded by confusion shown by Neptune and a lack of volition shown by the Sun. Neptune is disposed to Jupiter, which means it was being felt by the pilot, because Jupiter represents the pilot, as we said. It is the provider of the flight in this analysis that we're doing. So the Sun is ruler of the 9th of foreign lands, which Captain Shaw was providing through this flight. He was headed to China. He was taking the passengers to Beijing. We can therefore ascribe all 3 Pisces planets in the 4th as significators of Captain Shaw down here. And this is through the rulership of the Sun as provider of foreign lands here. The IC in the 4th house down here, so MC is at 5, IC here is at 5 also. It's right on top of Neptune. So the IC in the 4th house is always a place of danger because it is in the darkest part of the day. That's the midnight part of the cycle there, the daily cycle. The 4th is also the nation, and the water sign of Pisces signals a need to transcend physical or material limitations. There's an important fixed star called Deneb Adig, which is located at 5 degrees Pisces right now, the exact degree of Neptune and the IC. I want to read to you what the website Constellations of Words, which is a website I highly recommend for this kind of work. This is what it says about Deneb Adig, also known as Arion to the Greeks, which is located in the constellation of Cygnus. So, Constellation of Words says, quote, both Arion and Orpheus were famous lyre players turned into a swan at death. Arion, who lived, the swan being Cygnus, of course. Arion, who lived in Corinth, was the best sitarist or lyre player of his time. On his return from an artistic tour in Italy, he was robbed by the crew of his ship and forced to cast himself into the sea. Now Arian, not wishing to die in a meaningless way, decided to take for his shroud the sophisticated attire he used to wear at competitions, and with it on, to sing a final song to life, as swans generally do, end quote. It's from this myth of the swan song that we get the expression to play one's swan song, so one's final departure song. Here's a picture of Arian when he cast himself into the sea with his crew. And here's an image of the constellation Cygnus, located in the sign of Pisces. You can see that it's here's Deneb Adig, right in the middle of the swan, and it's you can see it's a large bird facing downward into the sea. Does it look like a plane headed into the ocean? It does to me. At this point, having assigned these planets to Captain Shaw, we have to ask ourselves, does this all point to a suicide murder plot by Captain Shaw, the pilot of MH370, as the theory alleges? When I saw these 3 planets at the pivot point of this chart, it was the first thing that came to my mind, I must confess. But there are a few unexplained dots that really don't connect to this theory. I mentioned that the moon is being appropriate to the situation of danger by being protective. That's what the moon does. Had he been deliberately malicious, this moon would look more malicious. It doesn't. It looks confused because of this corruption here. And like his will is being impeded. The sun is always a symbol of justice. That is the title that they gave to solar deities in antiquity. Solar deities were the gods of justice. And Shaw belonged to a political party called the People's Justice Party, which is interesting. This is an important detail because his being a vocal political member of the opposition party to the government came up in the investigation as a possible motive for the murder-suicide theory. The combination of Sun, Neptune, and Chiron does indicate that the flight was impaired and disoriented. And while Neptune, together with Sun, does often come up in charts of those who can be self-destructive or suicidal, Neptune is not a planet that indicates malicious intent of the sort that would drive a suicidal person to also murder 238 other people in the process. Let's not forget that, right? This is a murder-suicide, not just a suicide. Neptune is an ego-denying planet. So I'm not, really convinced of this theory so far. Jupiter's affliction by Pluto in the second, so here's Jupiter, here is Pluto opposite Jupiter. So that affliction by Pluto in the second doesn't indicate a corruption of the pilot. Rather, it indicates an unseen coercive force manipulating money or assets and opposing the pilot. And this is because an opposition aspect always involves different people in opposing camps. This is important. A more appropriate interpretation of that Jupiter-Pluto opposition suggests that Shaw might have been the unwitting victim of hidden financial coercions rather than instigating them himself. This is supported by the fact that nothing in Shaw's mental health assessments indicated psychological distress, financial problems, or political fanaticism, as some of the tabloids have argued. But there is no evidence of that in his psychological assessments. In fact, the report says there was nothing really unusual in them. Common sense would also argue that he would not have needed to kill 238 other people to make a political statement. But if he had, wouldn't he have left a statement to that effect? What kind of political statement communicates in silence? So this combination of Cancer and Pisces planets, particularly having Chiron present, could just as easily indicate an incapacitated airplane with the pilot being forced to surrender his unresponsive vehicle to the sea. That's what it could also look like, and actually does to me. So the next question then becomes, what opposing force does the Pluto corruption of Jupiter point to? Pluto is in the second house of money. Here it is. I didn't circle it, but here it is. which is what we need to follow to understand the rest. Another important money clue comes from the fact that Neptune and the IC are both at the same degree as the lot of debt, or sometimes called the part of debt by the Arabs, who used parts instead of lots. Lot is the word that the Hellenistic authors use. Same thing. So this would be the part of debt is located right in Neptune, the planet that has to do with the surrender into the sea that we were talking about before. So alone, that wouldn't mean much, this part of debt, if it were by itself, except that this chart is screaming several other indicators pointing to debt as a major motivator for this flight's disappearance. The first is the placement of Jupiter in the 8th house of debt, as I already mentioned earlier. The moon, its provider, is exactly opposite the ascendant, suggesting that safeguarding from debt, as well as death, was the other main enemy of this flight. Additionally, in the myth of Arion, recall, it's the fixed star located at 5 Pisces there, where Neptune is. Arion was robbed by the crew of his ship and forced to throw himself into the sea, again suggesting a financial motive for a loss into the sea. Next, the manager of the 8th house of debt is Venus, which is in the 2nd house of money and assets. Here's Venus. It is the triplicity ruler of the 8th, and it is here in the 2nd house of assets. The 8th shows money in other people's ledgers, that is debt, while the 2nd shows the assets of the entity in question. So that would be MAS, or Malaysia Airlines. And lastly, the first planet to rise before the flight, which is still pivotal when it departed Kuala Lumpur, is Saturn, which is the ruler and provider of the 2nd house of money, as well as the 3rd of documents. So here is Saturn, ruler of Capricorn and ruler of Aquarius. So Capricorn, the house of money, and here the 3rd house of documents. So it rules both. And Saturn, like Jupiter, is also out of sect in a nocturnal chart. And at night, Saturn indicates obstructions rather than goals or commitments. Placed in the 12th, it says that financial auditors are providing obstructions to secrets that need purging, communicated by the sign of Scorpio, which is this sign where Saturn is located. The reason I'm interpreting Saturn as auditors here is because as ruler of the 2nd and 3rd, right, money and documents, Saturn can provide financial documents, that's what it does, as provider of those houses, in its capacity as an enforcer, which is a Saturn thing, with some bureaucratic or institutional authority, which is what Saturn is, someone with some authority that is bureaucratic or institutional. Now, at this point, given all of these indicators of debt and money, I no longer believe that Captain Shaw planned a murder-suicide, given that nothing connected him to any financial debt, which is the strongest signature tied to the chart's ruler. We now need to re-examine Jupiter, but this time as significator of a different actor. Remember how I said earlier that Jupiter can signify the provider or owner of this flight? Well, while Captain Shaw would have been the immediate provider of the flight, the actual owner was the Malaysian National Wealth Fund, known as Khazanah National Berhad, or Khazanah for short. It was administered by the Ministry of Finance, which at the time, 2014, was under the control of Najib Razak, the Prime Minister of Malaysia, who governed from 2009 to 2018. I didn't know anything about Malaysian politics or about Malaysian Airlines before I looked at this chart. But I had to do a bit of digging into the airline and the government situation in 2014 to make sense of what I was seeing. Now, apparently, 2014 was a very turbulent political time in the nation, and the story gets a bit hairy, so bear with me as I explain the background. Those of you who are in Malaysia will know better than me. But the main thing to understand is that there was a massive conflict of interest between the government, acting through the Minister of Finance, and his investments that he then also controlled. as majority shareholder in these government-linked companies. Let me back up a bit to give you the relevant background. Khazanah, okay, so Khazanah being the owner of Malaysia Airlines, is wholly owned by the Malaysian government and serves as the strategic investment arm of the state. It's a wealth fund, okay, for the state. In 2014, it owned controlling shares of Malaysia Airlines. Also, in 2009, the government of Najib Razak had created a strategic development company called 1MDB, which was aimed at ensuring the economic development of Malaysia. Now, throughout 2014, 1MDB and Najib's government had just begun to become embroiled in what would later become a huge national scandal of large-scale theft of public funds. That year, 2014, the year of this flight, there had already been several changes in the auditors for 1MDB, including the refusal of the accounting firm Deloitte, who's a famous accounting firm. They didn't want to sign off on 1MDB's books for 2013 and 2014 because of missing documents and unverified transactions, the Saturn that I mentioned earlier. These and other improprieties raised mounting suspicion and criticism. And as I mentioned, auditors show up in the chart as Saturn in the 12th house of secrets. By late 2014, debt levels for 1MDB had reportedly climbed to nearly $11 billion US, 700 million of which were later discovered to have been embezzled into Najib's personal offshore accounts. Due to mounting public accusations of corruption and large-scale investigation ensued in 2018, and the opposition party, of which Captain Shaw had been a vocal member, would win the elections in 2018, whereupon a large-scale investigation of the corruption began. But by 2014, this was all already broiling, and there were already criticisms hovering about his government. So the scandal continued, and by 2020, a prosecution and conviction landed Najib Razak, the prime minister, in jail for 12 years. Still, aside from Shaw's political leanings, what does any of this have to do with MH370, you might ask? Well, apparently, Malaysia Airlines had never been very profitable. In 2012, there had been an attempt to privatize the company by merging it with AirAsia. But that plan was blocked by the airline's labor unions, so it failed. If you recall, there were actually two Malaysian airline disasters in 2014, for those of you who remember. MH370 in March, and let's not forget MH17, the missile attack in June, just 3 months after. That plane, the MH17 plane, found itself flying over a war zone in Ukraine, also under very suspicious circumstances. The twin Malaysia airline tragedies had a major measurable impact on its bookings, causing the airline to go deeper into the red. However, this ultimately actually benefited the 1MDB accounts. In August 2014, the Khazanah Fund, under Najib's finance office, so he controlled the Khazanah Fund, announced its intention to purchase the remaining ownership of Malaysia Airlines from minority shareholders and delist the airline from Malaysia Stock Exchange, thereby fully renationalizing it. So it had 69% of the shares before, and after, in August of 2014, it became wholly owned by the government, right, after these two disasters. But Malaysia Airlines' massive post-2014 losses, which the government argued was too much of a national asset to allow to fail. Remember, where have I heard that before? Too big to fail. So these losses indirectly enabled the finance minister to extract public resources from Khazanah coffers, which were then funneled to cover 1MDB's mounting debts. So this created a vicious cycle. Masses drain on Khazanah, reduce its portfolio returns and liquidity, Yet the government, via the Ministry of Finance, still compelled Kazanok to redeem shares or inject capital that was then redirected to 1MDB bailouts. Or to put it more simply, the inability to allow MAS to fail, MAS Malaysia Airlines, became the excuse to redirect public funds to cover up Najib's secret corruption. Essentially, Najib was sentencing the nation to slowly sink with him into the puddle of his own making. Under that scenario, rather than Shah attempting and failing to save himself and his plane from certain death, which he did attempt, Jupiter then becomes the finance minister, attempting but failing to save himself and the nation from the debt he created. So Jupiter does become ruler of both of these scenarios, and it fits both of these scenarios quite well. So there's an interesting fixed star. That's another interesting part of this. There's an interesting fixed star at 7 Virgo in the 10th house, which is where we'd locate the government or the employer of the flight. So here, right, 7 Virgo. The star forms an exact T-square with the moon and the descendant and ascendant. So 7 Virgo up here in the government house. Here we have the moon, and here we have the flight. So the star that forms this T-square is called Thuban, and it's in the Draco constellation. The Draco represents the dragon that protects the golden apples of the tree in the garden of the Hesperides in the myth. So of this star, George Noonan's book, and he has this great book called Fixed Stars in Judicial Astrology, and he states of Thuban, quote, Thuban indicates prospectors of gold and silver, or those who are ministers of money, end quote. The part of fortune of the Malaysian national chart seen here, here's the part of fortune in the chart, is exactly conjunct Jupiter of the MH370 chart, right? Suggesting that the path of this flight was tied to the national coffers, not just because it was a company asset, but because of the national debt that was to increase because of its disappearance. So this chart, by the way, comes from Nick Campion's Book of World Horoscopes. It's the chart for Malaysia for September 16, 1963. It's the second one he lists, in case you want to recreate it. In addition, the 8th house of debt of the flight's chart, so let's go back there, falls in the 2nd house of Malaysia's chart. So the 8th house of debt of the flight's chart, so this house here, is actually the 2nd house of Malaysia, of the chart of Malaysia, which is the house of assets, right? So we have the debt connected to the flight, connected to the coffers of Malaysia. The last thing I want to point out in this chart involves Venus in the 2nd house at 1 Aquarius. So here's Venus at 1 Aquarius. Venus is triplicity lord of the 8th, and therefore the manager of the debt or death, both of which are relevant. In the 2nd, it points to an acquisition of funds generated by this flight. This would be the money that was redirected from Kazanok. At 1 Aquarius, it's located at the degree of the fixed star Sham in the shaft of the constellation Sagitta. Sagitta represents the arrow that Hercules used to kill Aquila the eagle. Manilius says, quote, the arrow will bestow the skill of hurling the javelin with the arm, of shooting the arrow from the string and missiles from rods, and of hitting a bird on the wing in the sky, end quote. So here we have the acquisition of money becoming one with the projectile imagery that hits the wing of a giant bird. Very revealing. Venus is exaltation lord of Pisces. It therefore elevates the nation at the bottom of the chart, and all of the subterfuge that we spoke about with regard to the pilot and the plane and the Pisces planets. So it elevates all of this, meaning all of the stuff connected to the hitting of the plane hitting the sea. It's all down here. And this Venus, the acquisition of money, managing of debt, bringing all of this down. Before wrapping this up, it would be nice to try to at least locate the area of the ocean where the plane might have fallen. To that end, we can advance the chart in real time to when the sun reached the IC of the chart. This would indicate the point at which the sun, or the principal of the flight, that is the pilot, he's the head of the flight, reached the lowest and most dangerous point in his trajectory, that is the sea. In this chart, it occurs at 1:24 a.m. local time. The IC is the point of the chart when the sun reaches its northernmost point at the summer solstice. The sun at the north suggests that the plane went down not in the Indian Ocean, as has been continuously reported, but to the north of Kuala Lumpur, perhaps somewhere in the South China Sea, off the southern coast of Vietnam. If MH370 had continued normally on its planned route, the IC would have represented the most northern point of its journey, which would have been Beijing. The asteroid China is actually at 4 degrees of Gemini, very close to the Moon in the 7th, and close to the exact square with Neptune. Again, it suggests that the plane might have gone down in the South China Sea, not in the Indian Ocean, which would be southwest of Malaysia. Hours after the alleged turnaround of the flight, which would have occurred just after the last radar contact when the pilot said goodnight to Malaysia air traffic control, according to air traffic control records, that occurred at 1:19 a.m. 3 minutes later, at 1:21, the aircraft disappeared from the radar of air traffic control after passing navigational waypoint Agari in the South China Sea between Malaysia and Vietnam. You'll note that this is just 3 minutes earlier than the sun's activation of the IC that I mentioned is probably when the flight went down. After this point, the military claims it continued to track the aircraft back over Malaysia into the Andaman Sea until 2:22 a.m. After that, the aircraft's whereabouts were supposedly tracked by automated handshakes between the SDU, which is the satellite data unit on the aircraft, and the Inmarsat satellite communications network. Based upon the international team's investigation of that data, President Najib made this announcement on March 24, 2014. He said, "Using a type of analysis never before used in an investigation of this sort," he says, "Inmarsat and the AAIB have concluded that Flight 370 flew along the southern corridor and that its last position was in the middle of the Indian Ocean west of Perth, Australia. This is a remote location far from any possible landing sites. It is therefore with deep sadness and regret that I must inform you that, according to this new data, Flight 370 ended in the southern Indian Ocean," end quote. Initially, I seriously expected that this chart would have confirmed this announcement. But to my surprise, not only does it contradict the Inmarsat data, but the picture I'm seeing is rather difficult to explain without a lot of misdirection on the part of the media and official institutions, particularly the Malaysian government. To be quite honest, and in solidarity with the frustrated families, I do think the case has been mired in a lot of unexplained stonewalling and withholding of crucial information by the Malaysian government. So the chart actually gives us an explanation for some of those red flags. However, for a commercial airliner to have been taken down by force, surely someone would have seen something, right? Indeed, there were a couple of eyewitness reports of a commercial airliner in distress in the initial hours of that morning over the South China Sea. Mike McKay, a New Zealand engineer on an oil rig, claimed he and his colleagues saw a low-flying aircraft resembling a passenger jet with its right engine on fire, trailing smoke and flames streaking across the sky before vanishing. McKay was fired by his company for reporting the incident to Vietnamese authorities, which is itself quite puzzling, I must say. A Vietnamese fisherman also reported something similar around the same time and place. But a few days after these very early eyewitness reports and after the Inmarsat data had been made public, the media narrative shifted. The reality is that the Malaysian military at the time did not have the capacity to remotely jam any aircraft. Either it took down the plane with a missile strike, or it relied on the help of a technologically more advanced military to jam the aircraft remotely, or it exploded something on board. That's another possibility. And actually, in her book, The Disappearing Act, The Impossible Case of MH370, Florence DeChangi, an investigative journalist for Le Monde and president of the Foreign Correspondents Club in Hong Kong, where she was stationed at the time, she questions the official narrative regarding the plane's diversion to the Indian Ocean. Based upon an analysis of all of the available official reports, she contends that there are too many inconsistencies between the actual data and what's been reported about the data. She argues that the Malaysian government is engaging in deliberate and proven misdirection, and that they indeed had help from American AWACS who were in the region at the time, engaged in military exercises, and who did have the capacity to remotely jam aircraft communications. In her recreation of the timeline, the MH370 came down in the South China Sea at about 1:45 a.m. If we take the chart at face value, I'd have to agree with her on the basis that Najib Razak's government had the motive, opportunity, and, as former minister of the military, probably also had the means to orchestrate the downing of this flight, as well as its cover-up, in an attempt to create an excuse to organize a public bailout of 1MDB. Last week, the Malaysian Ministry of Transportation announced that a deep-sea search for the aircraft by Ocean Infinity would resume in late December. Their previous attempt in the Indian Ocean was reportedly interrupted earlier this year due to bad weather. The media has been careful to repeatedly tell us that the continued search was negotiated on a, quote, no fine, no fee basis. So perhaps we should not hold our breath. Najib Razak, who currently sits in jail on a 12-year sentence for embezzlement and corruption, but whose sentence was commuted to half that time, will, on December 22nd, hear a verdict on his application for yet another resentencing, this time for a commute to house arrest. Let us know in the comments your thoughts on this chart and how it might help shed some light on this mystery. And thanks for watching.